Bonjour.
Good morning to all of you. Henri GIBIER, head of the Les Échos magazine. I will be moderating this session. It's an exceptional meeting. The Cercle des économistes meeting is being held on the River Seine. So the theme of today is mobilizing savings to invest in our future. So in France, we save a lot, but we are reluctant to invest in the development of the economy. The situation has been compounded with the health crisis because we think that 50 billion worth of savings have been saved by French people. It's a precautionary measure. I will introduce you to the different speakers. So I will introduce the coordinator, Michel Didier, is running the Economic Institute. Rexecott is one of the best economic experts on this field. He spent 20 years at INSEE and he worked in the different divisions at the Ministry of Economy, and he succeeded Mr. Jean Forestier, and he was a member of many boards, among which the Social and Economic Board. So he's a member of the Cercle des économistes, and he will set the ball rolling. So I will give him the floor without further ado. Thank you, Henri. So I will introduce the debate. So I will talk about the macroeconomic situation, and I will be elaborating on the financial balance patterns. Our economy was constrained because of the health crisis, and production dwindled because of COVID-19, and the financial patterns have been turned upside down. So there would be a recession, 8% for France, and for other countries, 12%. So the French GDP will dwindle by 10%, and it means more than 200 billion euros. And there's something that we need to bear in mind. The drop in GDP means that the national income will also dwindle. So this drop has been passed on the economic balance, especially investment savings, have been impacted. The administrations, public sector, have posted a drop of 180 million euros, and companies managed to get some credits, and households increased their savings. I would say 100 billion euros. It's higher than the figure mentioned by Henri. Why is it it's a temporary imbalance. It is the result of constrained behaviors. So what's at stake now is to know what will be the next momentum following this temporary imbalances, how the economic stakeholders will react. So, and what can we do in order to avoid a sustainable or lasting economic slump? What is important is to make sure that the economy picks up, because we're afraid of a decrease in productive investment. Why? Because strong decrease in corporate savings, i.e. the results, high debts, and the balance sheet will deteriorate, the risks will get higher, a lack of clear outlook. So it will be important to beef up investments. And of course, there are lots of investment requirements, climate, research, technology, health, and all the rest of it. But these investments imply that we need to adapt ourselves. But the cost is high, and their profitability is quite remote and uncertain. And installed capital will have to be revamped or will have to be scrapped. And it would boil down to an economic loss. Involuntary savings for households will be geared towards consumption, but the savings rate will be above the level it posted before the crisis because of the health crisis, new spike in COVID, a stronger version for risk risks. So we want to make sure that there's a link between investment needs and savings. The traditional funding channels might not be adapted to take up the challenge. So by way of introduction, I will focus on 10 avenues in order to kickstart the debate. And I think that there will be lots of issues and questions regarding investment. The first idea that comes to mind is to increase public spending directly. There are lots of projects, infrastructure networks, 5G networks, and so on. And the link between the savings and investment are being done immediately. So you need to capture people's incomes, and it will be allotted to investments. And of course, we might be tempted to bequeath the bill to our children, but there's a risk because we might create an eviction effect because we might siphon off savings that could have been geared towards investment, private productive investment. So at the end of the day, it wouldn't change anything. Second avenue, and it's an avenue that I do support. So to reconcile private initiative that is governed by profitability and the need to take into account the collective social advantages, i.e. To invest in the long term, as it is the case with climate. And question number two, maybe the state should incur the losses induced by the changes to technologies, and we should be gearing towards investments in climate change. There's another avenue that we could tap, the role of a state, i.e. to reduce uncertainties by the state. To lessen uncertainties will boost savings and will facilitate productive investment. So there are two questions to consider: the future of guaranteed loans, the PGE. It was a good measure to safeguard the economy as part of the bailout plans, but these are loans, so you have to consider the fixed installments for companies, so they have to be prudent and cautious. So in order to reduce risks, it's important to develop participative type of loans without any predefined maturities, and the reimbursement patterns will be passed on future benefits. Is it desirable? Is it something that we wish? Is it possible? Is it feasible? By the same token, industrialists have said that they are ready to invest in a climate transition, provided that there is some visibility. I do insist on that. Hence, question number four, issue number four, shouldn't we raise the issue of a midterm unguaranteed trajectory regarding carbon price in terms of savings? There should be savings intermediation, and institutional investors will have to possess risky assets. So isn't it time to relax insolvency too, and the share ratio should be beefed up because it is quite low. There's another question that we need to envisage. We should rely on regional funds close to the local ecosystem in order to funnel the personal savings towards local companies and businesses. Hence, some companies could cooperate, because if they were to work alone, they might be priced out of the market. Some people have said that the European Central Bank should invest in natural savings and invest in artificial savings. They could mint money that could be invested in climate projects. So investment through direct money supply creation, is it feasible? Is it a direct process? You have to consider the tax system regarding savings. And we have a flat tax, so we are almost in the same situation as the other European countries. should we imagine new tax mechanisms in order to boost savings, invested savings, and there might be some tax loopholes. And we would open up another controversial issue, the tax regime for capital expenditure. Moreover, it's important to define system of investments in climate change or in health. Should there be a program of investments in France and some specific programs in order to boost private savings to fund this program? So we could also boost ethics savings based on solidarity, and there are obvious reasons, but there are also some economic reasons. It's a matter of beefing up savings as a whole. So what could be the practical and concrete means of actions, and what are the expected results in macroeconomic terms? So these are some questions and issues that I would like to raise, and I will give the floor to the different participants. Thank you, Michel. My task is not easy, because if we were to ask our guests to answer all these questions, it would take us the whole day. So if I were to oversimplify what has been said, how can we direct in savings, how savings will be invested? So what about these investments? How can they be attractive to investors? And how can we reassure investors and savers to embark upon these investments, and how people can use their savings away from passive products that are not really beneficial to the economy? Mirela AGACHE-DURAND, you are the general manager of Groupama Asset Management, more than 100 billion of outstanding payments being under management. Before, you were the deputy director of the Banque Postale and deputy director of Deville Finance. So you've talked about the direction of investments and the direction of savings. And I think that you've pondered over that, and you can provide us with some answers. I'm delighted to be with you and to be the spokesperson of our industry. So I will put on my cap as we had the strategic committee. So we worked on these themes with my colleagues, and we will be delivering a summary of our proposals. Yes, but do concentrate on the French case. There are 675 management companies in France, and some of them are around the table today. So there are three avenues that we've considered. We need to agree on something. So savings should be geared towards high operations. So we want to use savings to be invested in companies. So we need to invest in long-term operations, long-term investments. So how can we make sure that investors and savers tap this segment? Do we have the right tools and instruments? Do we need to create new tools and instruments? And I think that we worked on that. So there are different avenues. There are lots of instruments, lots of tools. We have the corporate savings plan. We have the stock-based savings plan, and these investments will be geared towards these small companies and businesses. How can they be more attractive? We have the pension savings plan, individual pension saving plans, collective savings plans. So there's something to be done. Should we create a new savings plan in order to boost the economy? So we'll come up with an initiative, and I will talk about it. So it is called CEDRE, Savings Bank, or Sustainable Stimulus Savings Plan. For example, we want to focus on the long-term sustainable recovery. This is what matters. This has to do with investment policies in energy transition programs, in health programs, in digital programs. I mean, the avenues of the future. And this plan could compete with the traditional savings account. And it could be a contract for the public at large with a ceiling akin to the current savings bank's account, and savings will be invested in the key sectors of the future. So we want to make sure that the people who have a traditional savings plan, how can we make sure that they turn to other products so that they can invest in future programs? So we need to focus on sustainable environment programs, and people could invest their savings in sustainable programs. And I think that we will we need to think about support solutions in terms of risk-taking. So these are proposals that we are making. So do we need to support these contracts with a warranty for the whole capital or for part of a capital? So we have some proposals. There would be a freeze period for these contracts. These are tools that we have at our disposal. So we need to use these tools so that these assets are more attractive. Do we need to adapt the tax regime for these contracts? And I can tell you that we have some precise specifications to bolster these initiatives. And we will put forward these instruments in order to help the recovery. And moreover, it's not a matter of 12 months, 3 years. The time horizon is above 8 or 10 years. So we need to cast a future-oriented eye. The industries will be transformed. We mentioned them. And when you transform an industry, it doesn't happen overnight. So we need to get some instruments that will make it possible to get a long-term horizon. So what does it mean to invest in the long term, especially when you look at the stock market prices every day? So we need to work on that, of course. And we need to focus on regulations, to focus on long-term savings. There are lots of stumbling blocks, in fact. So we need to turn to private customers, and they will get some contracts for 8 years with some investments contracts with a low level of liquidity. This is what I wanted to tell you. Thank you.
I'm going to hand the floor to Michel Cicurel, who's an economist. He's had a very, very long career in finance. He started off with La Compagnie Bancaire, moved on to Rothschild Company. Michel, you founded an investment holding company which is called La Maison, which attracts major European investors, and you also have your own consultancy firm. My colleague earlier on was talking about the lack of certainty among savers pertaining to different types of investments that are deemed necessary for society and for the economy. Madame AGACHE-DURAND evoked the question of reassuring savers about risk-taking in certain investments. And I think you too have been thinking on this subject, and I believe you have some answers for us. Well, thank you very much, Henri. Hello, everybody. I really am sorry not to be with you in flesh and blood, but I'm with you in spirit. Yes, this way of allocating savings, I would call it savings coloured by fear. They're fearful about investing to reconquer new territories. So in Europe, France is one of those savers with Portugal, Spain and Italy, and or rather we are one of those which spend our money compared to the frugal countries. The French are very clearly defined. So there is savings which have been accentuated by COVID, up to 22%. That's a very high figure. And the savings by households is over 5 billion euros now, and it's within the top ranking figures in the world. The problem is that our mass savings is practically entirely precautionary savings. The life insurance and very safe products. And when the French invest, they invest in their main residence, which is a very sure investment. And so they're investing in their accommodation. But in France, there's also a contradiction. They have the highest precautionary saving with the welfare state, which is very protective. And perhaps there's another third point which we could point to, which is pessimism among the poorest countries in the world. These savings fund the state through the Euro funds. That's one of the reasons why, in my opinion, French public debt inspires confidence and is broadly covered by national savings, as is the case in Japan, where the public savings compared to GDP is about 2.5 times that amount. So it's much higher than we have here in France, but the savings are high in both countries, France and Japan. There are very few individual investors in the stock market, although there have been more over recent weeks. We have much fewer than the States and China. Those are the two big capitalistic countries in the world today. Our firms, apart from those that are in the CAC 40, they are contributing more to the welfare state than their competitors. They are less profitable. They have higher debt. They have 1.5 times the GDP in terms of debt. And national savings is risk avoidant. And so there's a lot of risk in future sectors such as digital technologies, ecology, biotechnologies. They are sectors where risk is thought to be high, which is a shame because company savings are down to 70 billion. And I would like to pacify Henri and Michel, because I think those 55 billions that Michel quoted was in the first 6 months, and the 110 which Michel said was for the year. So they were saying the same thing. We were talking about confinement. So I have got the exit codes, 70 billion less in company savings and 100 billion more for household savings, which are astronomical figures. It seems to me that if the welfare state has become so important over the last 20 years in France, it's because the savings has frittered away. The companies are no longer able to provide the population with work and revenue. So the welfare state is going to become more important. I've always thought that the German economy was prosperous because the public finance was healthy. And I think we could say that the opposite, in fact, that we could say that public savings are healthy because the environment is healthy. I think that that is the way that we have to go. We have had to mint some money to save the world from the depression in the beginning of the century. We're going to have to do the same. If and there's going to be a lot of savings without risk. Mass savings in France is perhaps useless. I'm sorry to use that term, but that's because the central banks are there, and they're frustrating because it doesn't earn any interest. There's a negative circle, and that's getting more accentuated because France and its European neighbours have to involve in major transitions, digital technologies, environment, etc. Socially speaking, and Michel encouraged us with his 10th question to invest in solidarity investments. I believe that one way to do that is to invite savers, households that save, to invest in initiatives, because there are increasing inequalities in the world based on the lack of action and access to the world of tomorrow. Protecting the middle classes and the lower classes can only be ensured by the welfare state, and so saving has to become more profitable to avoid the increase in the amounts being saved, and they are losing value. And finally, I think there is a political imperative here, a social and an economic and a political imperative, because populism is against change if the people fear that they're going to be victims in the future. And that is a threat which is very high here in Europe. The solution seems exceedingly simple, too simple perhaps. It's very simple and it doesn't cost anything at all. We have to move from saving out of fear to saving in a conquering spirit. And it will be very good for households in France to save and access risk investments with a high yield, to ensure that the welfare state has to guarantee to take away the risk. And there are many high-risk investments which are very lucrative in the long term. The lower-risk investments don't fluctuate very much at all. So it's better for a state guarantee that there's not too much fluctuation. So we have to channel investments towards the technological and environmental transition. So this is a good way of increasing the revenue of savers who are not doing very well. And it's another way of encouraging more investment in the future without costing very much to the taxpayer. We can imagine investments with a double-digit ROI guaranteed by the state. And I think France is the ideal candidate to lead the way in Europe towards this inclusive capitalism. So that's what I wanted to say to you. Thank you very much, Michel. A lot of questions. We will have an opportunity to come back on your contribution there. Now I'm going to ask Laurence SCIALOM to take the floor. Laurence, you are a professor at the Parliamentary University. You specialize in banking finance. You also at the head of the Nicolas Hulot Foundation. And you have often taken a stance on questions pertaining to ecological transition and the role that finance can play in this process. Very recently, you were asking for mass investment in Europe for the ecological transition. So this is a theme which has been discussed frequently by different panelists. Michel Didier talked about giving greater visibility by readdressing that question of the medium-term trajectory of the price of carbon. Another speaker spoke about how we could make investment more appealing within the field of ecology. What's your solution? How can we direct savings towards that type of investment, which, as we've said, are long-term investments, perhaps less lucrative for the saver. Thank you. Before I answer your question, I would simply like to take a couple of minutes to explain why finance as it is operating today makes it impossible to reallocate the different funding, i.e. savings, from the brown high carbon sector to the ecological transition sector. Finance works on a basic principle. A given level of risk allows the investor to select high or low risk. The problem with that is that this way of working is pretty basic, as I've already said, and that leads to a structural underfunding in green investments and a lack of structure in the high carbon investments, the brown sector. There's a massive contraction of the price of carbon, and that's being undervalued in all risk management models, quite simply because these are models that are based on data from the past. And because we're talking about a future problem, the figures are underestimated. So we have this risk investing in the brown is underestimated. As far as yield is concerned, the overall yield in green investment is also underestimated, undervalued, because finance as it works today, well, when you invest, you only calculate your yield in what you can get back in money terms, which is quite logical. However, we are talking about investing in the public good on a worldwide scale. So there's a social element. If you reduce greenhouse gas effects, well, that's a positive outcome. Well, that's what the economists are saying. However, profitability of the brown sector is overinvestment because the person who invests only takes into account the monetary gains, but doesn't take into account the impact on the negative effects on society, for example. That's just the way it is in finance. So that means that the state, the central banks, have to intervene on a large scale to rectify that balance. Now, how could that be done? Well, there are different solutions that have been mentioned by Michel DIDIER, for example. That could be different tax schemes. That could be prudential rules and regulations, green in favor of the green sector, which would be quite legitimate because the primitive risks are systemic. We have learned this since 2015. The risk of the transition, there's a retroactive impact there. And the physical risk, the physical destruction of the asset is highly correlated to the risk. And so a green policy would be very welcome. That means that we should penalize a brown investment. One could imagine solutions and ratios of liquidity. We could also have ratios of maximum debt for the different financial players, or maximum exposure to risk of the different players in high carbon sectors. So it's a way of balancing them off. There are many possible solutions. It's important also to take a fresh look at why finance is so short-term, short-sighted. There's credit at high frequency, there's passive management. Today, most asset management is passive. So we are reproducing the indexes, and we are reproducing all of those carbon footprints of our economy. So but we have to go towards a greener economy. And I will just finish by saying, and I'm going to rise to the challenge which has been laid before me, the central banks. I am one of those few economists that have been talking on this subject, the possibility of the Central European Bank to wipe out the public debt, but only if there is mass investment in the ecological transition. I'm not meaning that we reduce the ratio of GDP. What I'm saying is we want to direct the all efforts in a different direction. So we want to avoid seeing that the debt being reduced and the savers saying, I'm going to pay more taxes, so I'm going to save to counterbalance that. So if we were to wipe out part of the public bank held by the European Central Bank, dependent on investment in ecology, to with respect to this GDP ratio, then some people might say that you're going to cause inflation to rise, and why not? The ECB is not managing to do that since 2013, so we're helping the bank to do that, and we can stop once we had caught up with that inflation deficit, which we've got since 2013, and that would have triggered the economy, inflated the economy, and we could perhaps avoid that Japanese scenario, which is hanging above our head in the Eurozone, and it could also help the Eurozone to stay together. But people aren't very interested in that because all of the central banks have that magical power of being able to function with negative capital rates because their debts are a counterpart to an arbitration between the confidence in fiduciary money, the confidence that everybody has in the long-lasting life of social interaction. So it would be the Draghi's text was all about destination of Europe. Now we have to think about the European solutions, European citizens in our solutions. Well, thank you very much. We're going to have a chance to talk about that. We've got half an hour left. But before then, I'm going to talk to François MALLET, who's head of Kepler Cheuvreux. We have already talked a lot about that divorce between the French and shares, the stock market. Michel Didier talked more technically about ratios, the ratios between shares, and how we can render investment more supple and more attractive. Laurence, SCIALOM, sketched out a scathing portrait of passive saving. And I think you are the person to give us a point of view on how we can resuscitate investment in the stock market here in France. First of all, I'd like to thank everyone for their points of views. I'd like that point 5, which was mentioned. It would be great if we could add greater flexibility and to encourage investors to be on the market. I am for passive investment. Of course, that's not the type of investment I'm going to be talking about today, because I'm going to talk about the stock market. That's what we foster in the longer term. A lot has already been said before I've taken the mics. It's hard for me not to repeat what has already been said. I would just like to add something about the savings flow. We talked about the flow, the outstanding flow of savings during the confinement. We've talked about 100 billion or more this year here in France. In Europe, the figure that I saw was 1,300 billion. There's amazing figures. You can't get your mind around that. But we know that these figures are very, very high. Of course, part of that is going to be directed into consumption. At least we hope that, because that's very important, even though we're talking about savings today. I think that part of that will also be injected into saving. Michel Cicurel talked very briefly about that, saying that savers, private savers, have been much more active over recent months. And we've got figures because we deal in volumes for private investors, and we have noted much higher volumes over the recent period. And so they're back, and I hope it's not just a short-term thing on the stock market. There are many reasons that explain this. People were at home, they had their partial unemployment payment, etc. They were furloughed, and so I hope that in all ways that that's going to last over time.
Back to the amounts, figures for the end of June 2019. So savings outstanding payments were worth 3,300 billion. So these are huge amounts of money, and they can contribute to investments. And you've mentioned savings being allocated to investments. If we have a look at the allocation of savings, 24% for current accounts, 32% in Europe, and this is what is precautionary savings, and the yields are almost inexistent, and the yields are negative for some European countries. Regarding savings, pension savings products, and life insurance products, 37% in Europe, 33% in France, and this topic was not addressed by the different people. What about the pension funds, the French pension funds? They do not exist. Is it a way of boosting long-term saving? Maybe we'll be talking about it later on. Back to the breakdown of savings, 24% of stocks being listed or non-listed. The figures are almost the same in France and in Europe. Debt instruments, 7% and 8% for other financial instruments. So here we are talking about investments in real estate. So by way of conclusion, we have a cautious approach by savers and investors, and they focus on assets that are not risky. But there is no such thing as a risky asset or a non-risky asset. So long-term investments were made possible through tax incentives that were granted, but tax incentives through the PE in France, the savings bank account. So when we have a look at investments in stocks and shares, it is quite low. But over the past few years, we've seen funds with ESG, ESG in English, ISR in France. So it's about the environment, it's about societal issue, and funds in corporate governance. So they collected a lot of money. I'm talking about these funds. They collected 595 billion euros. It's not huge, on a par with Europe, and it accounts for 2.5% of the assets under management in Europe. So the figure is quite low. So by the way, I looked at the background to the situation. In 1928, the first ESG fund was launched by the American Evangelical Church, and with some stocks that would eliminate shares pertaining to sins, tobacco, armament, and other themes. In the 1960s, they focused on human rights issues, and in 1990, there was a boost in the ESG funds. So I mentioned 2.5% for Europe. This is 5% in France. So we are doing better than the others, but there's still a long way to go. So how do we establish these stocks or values in these funds? We have a best-in-class category. We have some independent credit rating agencies. They are paid by the management companies and not financed by the companies that they grade. We've seen the damage of credit rating agency because they were remunerated by the companies that they grade. But at the end of the day, we have a list of values, a list of stocks that will correspond to funds that can be specialized or more general, or specializing in employment, specializing in environment, or specializing in governance. It's a significant phenomenon. When you look at the financial European analysts, they conducted some surveys, and 100% of analysts think that the ESG component is indispensable, and they need to pay heed to this element. Even in China, that's quite surprising. The percentage is 80 as against 53% in 2018, and only 11% of analysts think that ESG does not matter. So it's a significant topic that we need to market better. I'm talking about management companies, and my neighbor is very sensitive to investment-related issues. But it is incumbent upon governments to heighten the awareness of savers of these kinds of investments, whether they are constrained or not. I don't like this term demanding or constraining people, but savers, small investors should be made aware of these kinds of investments. There are other topics that I will revisit. They were mentioned by my colleagues. So there could be a large-scale program in infrastructures guaranteed by Europe and France. We could have a sovereign fund, not only at state level, but at the European level. And this could be a way of giving a minimum yield to savers. Savers will be reassured, and savers and small investors, they want to be reassured in the long term, so they should be given a guaranteed yield. But when the rate is zero, it's not. It's quite difficult. So we have to make sure that savers have some visibility. Second, I think it would be a good idea to create a European technological fund. Each country has adopted some initiatives in terms of loans and in terms of equity. Bear witness what has happened recently. The TB Commission will select a fund in the non-listed market. These funds will be financed by the BPI, by insurance companies, by management companies, and they should contribute to these funds in order to help finance technological companies. In the TB Commission, you have a non-listed part, but there's also a listed component. This is something that we tend to brush aside because it was not advertised. But it's possible to invest and to be supported by the different institutional investors, and we shouldn't underestimate the role of a state. And I did some research on the role of a state in the US. State agents helped the technological development. There's a U.S. Army division which played a key role in the development of the internet. So we should be in a position to create this kind of funding mechanism at the European level. And it would be a good idea to create a health-related fund. We've talked about the traditional savings bank account in order to fund housing. Maybe we could have a bank account, a COVID-based bank account with a minimum guaranteed yield. And I think that savers and investors are very aware of that. These are the topics that I wanted to address. Thank you. And we have lots of questions being put to us. Mirela AGACHE-DURAND, what can you tell us about these ESG funds? Only 5% in France. So, regarding their performance, what about these ESG funds? I mean, have they proved their worth? And how can we make sure that they are better known to savers and investors? We need to tap this wonderful opportunity. We need to make sure that savers feel safe to invest in companies with the ESG funds. We will be explaining to them the content of these funds. We will tell them why we've decided to pick up these securities, environmental securities, governance securities. In fact, because these funds are more virtuous, are wiser relative to the other products in the industry. So the the financial yield matters to the savers. I do agree that the financial yield is important, but you have to consider the collective yield. Fewer carbon emissions, better distribution of wealth through better governance. So that's important. In terms of performance, history cannot teach us that an ESG investment is similar to an investment in ESG without any criteria. So we could say it performs better or it performs less, but our investors won't focus only on these aspects. They will take into account the financial yield, of course. This is something that they can understand, but they will focus also on the collective investment, and this has to do with the evolution of our world. We've been securing a foothold on this segment. And we have the ESG label. But what is important is ESG integration in many management companies. Financial analysts, they have some metrics to analyze the situation and the yields, and there are some extra financial criteria that are being embedded in the management decisions. With SMEs, there are some people who will tell you they don't do ESG, but they focus on G, i.e. governance. They want to focus on governance in order to sustain the future of the companies. So companies do invest in governance, but they don't do it from time to time wittingly. So governance is important, and we need to be more educational. We need to explain things to people. In France, in Europe, we want to get good data. We want to have a good command of extra financial data, how companies are being graded. There's another problem, that of costs. All these extra financial credit rating agencies are being taken over by Anglo-Saxon players. So we will end up in a situation whereby we will depend on data, and when they are in a monopolistic situation in terms of data, you will have to pay the price for it. So we've taken part in a significant initiative with management teams at the European level. It would be a good idea to have an extra financial database at a cost that is quite affordable. It does cost a lot of money because you have some analysts that will try to retrieve these data, to collect these data in the corporate plans and programs. Allow me to talk about another topic. You mentioned capitals and green finance or brown finance. So these companies which do not invest in green products, they will be penalized. This is what is being said. So we have to be demanding, but we need to support companies. We need to embark upon a transition. When a company is using an older technology, but if this older technology has been used to develop our economy, these technologies should be in a position to change. But if these technologies, if these companies are deprived of capital, this will have an impact on jobs, and this will lessen the wealth of these companies. So it's important to support these companies. When you have a company that pollutes a lot, but when the company makes a commitment to changing the industrial processes in order to embark upon a green policies or governance-related policies, we need to reward them. So everything can be transformed, everything can be processed. So we need to help companies to transform themselves. We shouldn't focus on failure. We shouldn't deprive these companies of their wealth. We shouldn't punish them. I do think that we need to punish some companies. I listened to the scientists, and I've had a look at the reports. So damage is not linear. So you are a physicist, so you know what it's all about. So a world between 2 and 4 degrees, there's a huge difference between the two. There might be some biased processes. So, of course, we need to help companies so that they can diversify themselves, but I think there should be a massive reallocation. There will be some losers. Local authorities, the state will have to launch a significant plan in order to embark upon green programs. I mean, there will be some people who will be made redundant in the airline companies, but these people should be trained to a new sectors, to new environmental issues. So this is something that we've heard over the past 5 years. We've wasted 10 years. So we will be heading for a world that will be very difficult to insure. This is what insurance companies told us. It shouldn't be a gradual process. The time frame is very short. We know that some people will be in a bad patch, and we need to help and support that transition. Regarding investors, they are aware of that situation. They've taken some choices. So they are trying to move away from the old industries. So the automotive industries, they already make a selection. And of course, people will invest in electric cars, for example. But we have to be prudent regarding investments. We have 120 analysts, and they take into account the ESG dimension. There's a question that we haven't yet answered, is the financial components. So when we value a company, should the ESG mark represent 20% or 50%? And it's a little bit punitive. So it's still an open question. It's not always easy to encompass this financial indicator. Let us talk about pension funds. By the way, there are lots of questions, but there are lots of questions that we've already addressed. So I will pick up some questions that haven't yet been addressed. So these are anonymous questions. I won't mention the names of the people. So the low-rate policy will penalize savings and small savers, pensioners. What do you advocate in order to remedy this situation? Who would like to answer? Who would like to answer? We already broached it. Michel, do you want to add something? We're a bit schizophrenic. What is the general idea? When you have low rates, people can borrow, states can borrow, so they can spend and they can give a fillip to the economy. But I'm convinced that low rates will boost savings. That's a bit weird, but it's a reverse mechanism. There's a topic that we haven't really dealt with, pension funds. Our society is aging. We can't do anything about it. So people assume that they want to get some capital when they retire, because we're not quite sure that the pension system will pay for their retirement. So people want to build up a capital. They want to set aside some money. But if this money doesn't provide any yield, they will assume that they need to accumulate more money. So it's a bit bizarre. So if savings doesn't yield anything, you don't need to save. But that's not true. That's not true. In Japan, the rates are quite low, or the rates are equivalent to zero. So we had to change the system designed to tax the capital. So I think that capital yields should be more mainstream. So you have to consider the yields, but we need to talk about the yields of shares and stocks. And Mr. Cicurel has talked about something important, to move away from a punitive approach.
Would you perhaps like to speak out now about this question of low rates? Have you got anything to add? Indeed, nothing out of this world. However, I believe that what earns nothing, low yield saving is low risk saving. That's what people think. But high risk saving is really well remunerated, really well. And high-risk investments in new technologies, etc., have yield rates between 10 and 20%. So in reality, I believe that the only way to avoid this phenomenon which Michel DIDIER was talking about, which, because traditionally we would call it compensating inflation, but low rates have exactly the same impact as inflation. It's a euthanizing effect. I think from an economic point of view and from a sociological point of view, the middle classes, for reasons we're all familiar with, the way digital technologies have increased, evolved, and the emerging countries which are more competitive, the middle classes suffer two burdens there. If we don't help with savings, we are going to have a real problem with the middle classes. I would point out that households have a political, social interest in the risk rates. Thank you very much. There are many more questions about the role of the central banks, for example. This has already been broached, wiping out debts. We've talked about the role of Europe also. Because we have very few minutes remaining, perhaps we can talk about these pension funds. Is that a solution? None of you have talked about it so far. And behind that, there is the underlying problem of, and I'm putting myself in the shoes of a private investor, a private saver who wants to participate in a project which is good for the planet. But today, there are no really intermediates who can point out and help them, guide them as to where they could invest their money. Is that a role that the pension funds could play? I don't know if anyone would like to speak out on that subject. Yes, I could say a couple of words about that. The problem of pension funds has been brought to the fore again recently with these individual plans that we have here in France. They have different acronyms. Today, we want to help savers. They've got their collective pension savings scheme in their companies. There aren't very many of them in France. There are very different approaches, and the idea is to create tools for each person to save for their retirement. I think it's a really good initiative. And in that, we could place different investments which are longer-term investments, which need time, and we could include in there some investments which are perceived as higher risk, but I think we have to redefine what risk is. Higher risk in terms of fluctuation, volatility, because here we're talking about the fact that the great mass of savers have moderate savings, moderate revenues, and they are going to be the most exposed if there's low yield. If you have a savings plan that doesn't fluctuate very much, you've got very little risk in terms of fluctuation, but at the end of the day, if you don't have the yield to supplement your pension, which may be quite low at the end of your career, then we don't talk to them about that risk. So we have, with these pension funds, you have the time to bear fluctuations, and you can shoulder them because these are closed schemes which are closed until you retire. And in those schemes, you could have the kind of instrument which invests in the different environmental criteria of a company. And once we get out of this recession, that could give some meaning to that type of saving through savings with ESG criteria. So there are some tools in place. Some work very well. We've had some concrete experience. We've had some funds which came to fruition the end of October last year, or rather they were launched last year in October in our company, and we have had a super huge market share. We did 10% of these schemes out of all of the players in the market. We're not the biggest player by far, and that's because we give good advice and we explain what the purpose is. And we understand also how the plan, we explain so that the investor understands how that plan is constructed. So our success has been because of our ability to teach the saver. Dominique, if I would just like to come in on that. Yeah, I think we have to find a way of bringing to the fore longer-term players, and that will be the reform of Solvency II, amongst other things. We are in long financial cycles, and the problem of those who retired in 2008, even if we're talking about long-term investment for pensions, we are not going to be regulating the financial cycle. There's going to be a systemic risk which remains, and the day that you retire, it's a matter of risk. So we are not protecting the future retirees against this. In 12 years, we've got some experience to look back on. So it can be part of a broader reform which would involve the financial cycle. Yes, the governments, the Central European Bank intervene, and they are going to continue to do so. Not necessarily forever and ever, but I think the German courts have pointed out the weaknesses in the euro. And although Germany seems to be coming out of things okay, all of Europeans can take that road. We have a sort of Damocles over our head in terms of these purchases. So a central bank, if it says, I'm going to intervene perpetually, well, what's the scope of their intervention? So we are almost at the end of our round table, unless anyone wants to add anything. There was someone who's something which was missing here today. We're talking about savings, retirement, and the question of taxation comes back quite clearly. We hardly broached on the subject of taxation. There was very little tax talk around the table. Not even in the questions. Is that a sign of the times? Michel, would you like to wrap up on that, seeing as you opened the debate? Well, I don't want to wrap up, but I've just got a couple of comments to make. An answer to your... It's not an answer, but these are personal remarks. Today, we are in a traumatic situation. The population is traumatized. It began before COVID. There had been several conflicts in France, and I really do believe that now is not the time to address conflictual questions. Firstly, pensions. I think things need to be done, but I don't think we ought to open that issue completely, including the pension funds. And second, now is not the time to talk about taxation, because that is a conflictual subject. So to come to conclusions, we've got 2 minutes remaining. Let's come back to our main question. How do we get savings channeled into investments? No one's found the solution yet, not the ECB or anything else. I've got a couple of proposals, or Mirela had a couple of suggestions about different saving schemes, more open to other types of investment, not only social housing. That's something which we put forward. We suggested creating a savings scheme which is inclusive of all types of investment. If you're in a building society, for example, you don't have any tax advantages really, so it could be an opportunity to change that. And Mirela also didn't mention, but I think that this capital has to be guaranteed. If we don't offer guarantees for these new products, then people will remain with their traditional investments. And then I can't go through everything which has been proposed. However, Michel did make a suggestion. If investment which is not created on the stock market brings back 10 to 20%, why do people not choose that? Why do they not choose that option? Quite simply, the answer is that in return for that 10, 15%, they take a risk, and they just don't want to run that risk, or they can't take that risk. However, if we've got this average return of 10 to 15%, why does the state not become the insurer, the guarantor of the entire sum? And the state could also take 2% of remuneration, borrowing at 0.7, and then the state will be earning money. So everyone, it's a win-win situation for everybody. So there'll be a lot of money directed to non-floated companies. The state would reap benefits, and the savers would gain yield. So thank you very much, Michel, for that win-win proposal. So we've talked about how savings can be used. Thank you, everybody, for participating and for listening, and for those who will continue to listen to us, because I believe all of these discussions are being recorded and will be broadcast on the web. Thank you very much, everybody.